Countdown.
It's now. It's just loading. Just 1 second. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Please make sure you feel free to put your comments below this box. Ms. Wanda, we are live.
Great, thank you. And welcome everybody to the Baltimore City Consent Decree Monitoring Team's Community Forum. And with us tonight, we have two special guests. We have Reverend Kobe Little, who's president of the Baltimore chapter NAACP. And he's also vice president of the Maryland State chapter of the NAACP. And along with him, we have Joshua Harris, who is vice president of the Baltimore chapter of the NAACP. And I would like to welcome them to the forum. And Reverend Little, do you have some words you'd like to say to our audience?
Good evening. We are grateful for this opportunity to speak with the community and to hear with the community an update from the BPD monitoring team. We've seen a great need for this consent decree, and looking forward to hearing what progress has been made, what progress still needs to be made, and how the recent Justice Department rule changes will impact or not impact the consent decree process here in Baltimore. Thank you to Sister Watts for reaching out to the Baltimore branch.
Great, thank you. I would like to now introduce our panel. And we have Ken Thompson, who is the lead for the consent decree in Baltimore City. We also have Seth, you're there, I see you now. We have Seth Rosenthal, who is also one of the monitors for the consent decree. And we have Chuck Ramsey, who's down on the screen. Chuck, can you see me? Great. Chuck is usually busy on CNN, but we're not going to hold that against him tonight. And let's see, who else do we have? We have Miller Roberts with us, who is one of the community liaison coordinator. And let's see, do we have anyone else who's joined us? I think that's it. And I'm going to turn it over to Ken Thompson and the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you, Wanda, and greetings, President Little. And I'm so happy to have the opportunity tonight to not only talk to the community, but also to talk to your members who I'm certain are on the phone or somehow listening to what we're going to talk about tonight. And I thought what I would do is kind of give a framework, a backdrop of essentially how we got here. And we'll talk a little bit about the progress that we think we've made and the progress that we obviously know we need to make going down the road. So there's no need to go into the deep background because all of you know how the consent decree ended up being in Baltimore as a result of Freddie Gray. But what you need to know is when the monitoring team became involved and really began our work in February of 2018, after about 4 months of doing our due diligence, we determined, along with the parties, that the BPD was a highly dysfunctional organization. And it was not simply enough to put a Band-Aid on what we looked at as a very, very serious systemic problem. So the decision was made early on that this department essentially had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And that was the model, and that was the protocol and the plan that we embarked upon. And so recognizing that the police department is a paramilitary organization, the first thing that we had to work on and help the department work on were revising its policies. Now, some people will say, well, what's the big deal with policies? Well, if you understand anything about a police department, the policies are really the backbone of the department. They set the tone. They explain to the officers what they can and cannot do. And just as important, if not more importantly, they are the blueprint that the training is built around. So that if you don't have good policies, you're not going to have good training. And if you don't have good training, you're not going to have good police officers. So the monitoring team literally spent well over a year working on these policies, helping, along with the Department of Justice, helping the Baltimore City Police Department revise its policies where necessary, create new ones when necessary. And I can say to you today that as a result of that exercise, most experts who've looked at this will agree that the policies in Baltimore City, those that govern this particular police department, are essentially state of the art. They really represent best practices, and they're very good policies. And so once these policies were in place, the next step, what was critically important, was to develop the curricula and then the training. And I will say right now, President Little, your organization, the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, was extremely helpful in not only developing and helping us develop these policies, but they provided a lot of insight and input in terms of what the training curricula would look like. And so I can say to you tonight that the policies and the training have gone a long way to at least moving this department in the right direction. Now, this year, the judge made it clear that after 3 years, going on 4 years, we needed to see whether the policy changes and the revisions and whether the training was bearing the fruit that we all wanted to bear. So now that the officers have been trained, it's now time to do an assessment. In other words, we need to find out whether or not, after all the hard work and all the time that we've spent helping this department revise its policies and engage in the training, whether we are at a stage now where we can say that the department is moving in the right direction. And so what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit, well, not me, but my panel. We'll spend some time tonight discussing the next area where we are right now, which is we're transitioning into the area of assessments, and that is compliance assessments and outcome assessments. And my deputy, Seth Rosenthal, who heads this up for the consent decree, will spend some time going over that with you. He'll also talk a little bit about training, and in particular, training with respect to impartial policing. I also have with me tonight my other deputy, principal deputy monitor, Chuck Ramsey, and Chuck will talk a little bit about community policing, because at the end of the day, I mean, that's the model that we are trying to develop here. And I think it's always important to spend some time having someone from the monitoring team be present to discuss with the community exactly what community policing is all about. So let me turn it over to you, Seth. Let's talk a little bit about the training and hopefully a little bit about the assessment process. And then Chuck, I'd ask you to talk a little bit about community policing, then we'll open it up for questions. Seth?
Thanks, Ken. Good evening, everybody. I just want to add something to what Ken said about what we've been engaged in for the last several years in terms of policy revisions and training. Although we have been spending a lot of our time providing technical assistance, lending our expertise to the police department and helping them to revise their policies so that they're consistent with national best practices, and also helping them with their training curriculum, it's not like we've abandoned our monitoring role and only been a technical advisor. We have been monitoring during the course of the policy revision and training process too, and we continue to monitor during that process. Just as an example, just last week, BPD began its third tranche of training on fair and impartial policing, or anti-discrimination in policing. The first tranche of fair and impartial policing training was delivered in connection with use of force training in 2019. The second tranche in 2020 in connection with stops, searches, and arrests training. And now it's being delivered not as a standalone, because it's also being delivered in connection with refresher training on use of force, as well as refresher training on respecting First Amendment rights, like the right to free speech and the right to assemble and the right to record and observe and record police officers in the course of their official duties. But I'm going to be spending half the day tomorrow observing the second day. It's a 2-day training, the second day of that training. I spent most of last Monday observing the first day of the training. I should say that the training is continuous. This fair and impartial policing training, it's going to go on for 4 to 5 months until every officer in the department is trained. And so it's a 2-day training. You have a group of officers that come through on Monday and Tuesday. You've got another group of officers that come through Wednesday and Thursday every week. We, especially because that training is just getting underway, are observing most days of training. And so one of our colleagues spent the day today observing the first day, the Monday training session. I'm spending tomorrow, or at least part of tomorrow, observing the Tuesday session. We also spent time while the curriculum was being developed, observing pilot training and giving our suggestions, feedback, and critique of the instructors and the curriculum. So we have been engaged in assessments throughout the course of what we've been doing since the beginning. It's just that because we are now getting to a point in the maturation of the consent decree process where most policies are revised and training on most policies has been done, we can really begin to assess in earnest whether those revised policies and whether that training is having an effect, an impact on the street, whether it is really resulting in constitutional policing in Baltimore, whether it is really resulting in community-oriented policing in Baltimore. So this you actually, so we have undertaken some of these assessments already, just to determine where the baseline is, what the police department is doing or what has been doing historically. So as a for instance, last September, we published our first comprehensive report on the Public Integrity Bureau's performance in misconduct investigations for misconduct complaints made to internal affairs of the Public Integrity Bureau back in 2018. Unsurprisingly, we determined that there was a lot that needed to be done to improve the timing, the efficacy, and the efficiency of misconduct investigations, not least of which was keeping complainants, community members informed about the progress of the investigations. We're going to be undertaking another review of misconduct investigations later this year to see whether there have been measurable improvements, particularly improvements in the wake of the training of Public Integrity Bureau detectives that took place this past spring. It will not be as comprehensive an assessment as we did first time around. It will be more of a look under the hood to determine whether BPD is moving in the right direction. In subsequent years, or I should say probably as soon as next year, we'll undertake another comprehensive look to determine whether BPD is meeting the requirements in the misconduct investigations and discipline area of the consent decree. Right now, we have an assessment, a very large comprehensive assessment underway of the police department's use of force. And we're taking a look at the statistically significant sample of use of force incidents, use of force reporting, and supervisory review of use of force incidents for 3 calendar years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, to determine whether there's been improvements over time and how much further BPD has to go before it meets consent decree requirements. We're also planning and will be conducting later this year assessments in other areas. I mentioned the misconduct investigations area, but we're going to be conducting a full-blown assessment of how BPD has been doing in training its officers, whether it has been making arrests with probable cause, or conversely, whether it's been making too many arrests without probable cause and therefore unconstitutionally. We're going to be taking a look at the quality of BPD's investigations of reports of sexual assaults. We're going to start taking a look at investigative stops, when people are stopped on the street, when they're patted down for weapons, when they're searched. That is data that has been inaccessible to the monitoring team since the beginning, and really until now, because BPD is just now implementing and rolling out a brand new IT platform that will allow us to begin to take a look at data on investigative stops, on frisks, and on searches. So we have all of those kinds of assessments that are going to be taking place over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. We're actually going to be filing our budget, our annual budget, with the court tomorrow, perhaps on Wednesday. And that will show just how much emphasis we as a monitoring team are placing on these assessments, these compliance reviews and outcome assessments. You'll see that, the majority of our time over the course of the next year will be spent on assessments. We're going to continue to spend time on technical assistance. We're going to continue to observe training and doing things like that, but we really are going to be spending more and more of our time on assessments, because at the end of the day, whether BPD is able to get out from the consent decree ultimately will turn on whether it can show in a measurable way, based on the assessments that we're conducting, that it is engaged in constitutional policing, that it is engaged in community-oriented policing. And with that, I want to turn it over to Chuck to talk a little bit about the community-oriented policing aspects of the consent decree, because the consent decree really does have dual mutually reinforcing goals. As I just mentioned, constitutional policing and community-oriented policing. I've talked a lot about constitutional policing. I'm gonna have Chuck, and Ken's gonna have Chuck talk a little bit about the community-oriented policing aspects of the consent decree and where BPD now falls along the continuum of compliance there.
Thanks, Seth. And good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I want to talk about community policing, the training that's taking place. Earlier this year, the department developed a neighborhood policing plan, which both the Department of Justice and the monitoring team reviewed in its draft form and approved. They have since created training consistent with that plan. Again, DOJ and the monitoring team reviewed the curriculum and approved it. And this summer, they began the actual training. The training is 2-day training. It is being observed by members of the monitoring team. I have observed it, and others on the team have observed the training as well, to make sure that one is consistent with the plan itself and also the curriculum that was developed thus far. And it's continual, just like Seth mentioned earlier about the other training. You know, it's a large department, and that training is continual until all officers and supervisors have gone through that training. And so they're in the process now, and it will extend into the fall, obviously in early part of next year, more than likely, before the entire department is trained, and we will continue to evaluate. The officers are given surveys, one pre-survey at the very beginning to kind of get a sense and a feel for what they think community policing is, their attitude about it, and so forth. And then a post-survey, which is given at the conclusion. We should have some results. We've been getting information on a daily basis, but I think over time we'll be able to really put something together to see the impact that the training is actually having on the officers from what they believe going in versus the impact that it's having on them once they have gone through the training. And we'll certainly make that available for public consumption as well. So that's pretty much where we are in the community policing training. As I said before, it is 2 days in length. I observed a class 2 weeks ago. I'll be observing another class next week. I'm scheduled to be one of the observers. And again, we'll be able to provide feedback to the department. We have regular meetings with the department, in which their training division in particular, in which we're able to provide feedback from what we've observed, whether it's the instructor, comments on the instructor, or just how the material is being delivered. How interactive is it? How are the officers responding to the training? The kinds of questions that they're asking. What are those responses to the questions? All those kinds of things we'll be able to provide feedback to the department so they can make adjustments accordingly if needed. And that's pretty much where we're at with the community policing. So Ken, I don't know, you want to take it back?
Yeah, let's do this. We'll open up for questions, but before I do that, President Little, let me respond to your inquiry regarding the Department of Justice report that came out a couple of weeks ago. I think it's fair to say that the report, in many respects, mirrors what's already happening in Baltimore. I always hesitate to use the word that Baltimore is the model for consent decrees going forward, but so I'm not going to use that term, at least directly. But I will say that many of the many of the comments that were made in that report, they do mirror quite closely what Baltimore's already doing. And just by way of example, Baltimore was the first monitoring team in the country to actually go out and employ community or neighborhood liaisons. And we found that to be an incredibly helpful tool. It's the best way for us to have folks in the community not only be on the team, but they are ears and eyes in terms of what's going on out in the community. And with the COVID situation that is now, occupied everyone for the last year and a half, it is even more, and it has been even more important to have folks, while we're not sending our folks out in harm's way, because they do live in these neighborhoods, they get to hear things and they report it back to us. I think we are in a much better position to have our pulse on what's going on with the community. So to answer your question, I think it's probably a good idea to have everybody follow what Baltimore is doing, because I do think that we are ahead of all of the other consent decrees that were started years before we were. So hopefully that'll answer your question. So let's open up for questions.
Thank you. It does speak largely to the question that I was raising. And, our thanks to Mr. Rosenthal and Ramsey for their updates. We do have some questions based on the remarks that were offered by your colleagues. And I guess for Mr. Rosenthal, the first question that we'd have is that you have mentioned repeatedly that you've made observations, but I'm hoping that you can tell us what the substance of those observations so far are. And, as it relates to assessments, both to you and to Chief Ramsey, I'm curious about the community assessment component of your work. So, and as much as you're doing site visits and observing whether or not these policies are being implemented, please share with us what the component is for gaining feedback from the community, change or shift from what was. And I guess I'll start it out there, and I know that Mr. Harris also has some questions to raise as well.
Thanks so much, Reverend Little. I'm going to take your questions in reverse order. I'm going to start with, what the community component of our assessments look like. We are partnering with the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University to conduct community surveys. Oh, I think you guys have frozen up on me. Shoot.
We can hear you, Seth. You're just fine.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So I was saying we partnered with the Institute of Urban Research at Morgan State University for our community survey work, which is required by the consent decree. Morgan did its first community survey back in 2019, and we published the results in 2020. I suppose unsurprisingly, the results were that community members did not currently have a lot of trust in BPD, or at least a majority of community members did not have a lot of trust in BPD, but it was not an overwhelming majority. A number of community, a majority of community members also felt, that BPD did not comport itself properly, that it was, that it did violate constitutional rights on occasion, at least they had that perception, and that it did not treat people fairly and impartially, at least a majority of respondents.
Hey, Seth, do me a favor and let the audience know what time period that survey covered so that people understand that's not today, that's several years ago.
That's right. So the survey was conducted in 2019, and the survey ended in the summer of 2019. So actually it covered started in the winter of 2018 and went into the summer of 2019. And the results were published the following year in 2020, April of 2020. That said, there are some other results that were interesting, which is that, a majority of community members want to establish relationships with BPD and, want BPD to do the right thing. Majority are not opposed to that and haven't lost faith in the police. They actually believe that, the police can do good, and they're interested in having the police do good. They just want to establish a closer relationship with the police. And to some points that Chuck was making before, they really are interested by and large in community-oriented policing. They want to see the police out in their community, engaged with community members. Too many of the participants in that survey reported that they did not on a regular basis see BPD officers engaged in that kind of activity. It's exactly the neighborhood policing plan that Chuck referenced that is aimed at addressing that shortcoming. Actually, starting this week, Morgan State and IUR is beginning its second community survey, and it will be doing largely the same type of, we do the same type of survey and asking largely the same types of questions that it did the first time around to determine whether there are any meaningful changes in Baltimoreans' attitudes towards BPD. Data collection will take place between now and Thanksgiving. And the hope is that the IUR's report, monitoring team's report on community attitudes toward BPD, will be published in the early spring. And so that's what we're looking at. But that is one of the main ways that the consent decree, in a very sort of methodical way, intends on gauging community's attitudes towards the police. And that is one of the ways that we look to the community to determine whether BPD is improving. Not only whether the data shows that they're using force less often, and when they do, they're using it more often with justification, that they're less often stopping people in an unconstitutional way, less often arresting people in an unconstitutional way, more often dealing with people in crisis in a proper way. That's certainly one and a main way, and perhaps the main way to determine whether they're coming in compliance. But an equally important part of determining whether the BPD is coming into compliance is what the community thinks. And does the community actually believe, based on its experiences and its perceptions, that Baltimore police is improving, that Baltimore police are engaging in constitutional behavior?
Do you have plans to interview people who have been arrested, ticketed, or who have called the police for assistance?
So there are two different types of surveys of community members that we are doing, okay? The community survey, it has to be a random survey in order for the results to be scientifically valid. And so we can't pick out people in a purposive way to determine, okay, we're picking out people who've been arrested and have experiences with police. That said, there is a purposive component to Morgan's survey where we are trying to reach out to, generally speaking, harder to reach populations, more marginalized populations, which may or may not correspond with the populations that have more interaction with the police. But that is one component of Morgan's survey. The second survey that
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I mean, when you say it has to be random in order for it to be scientifically valid, that only depends on what the universe that you're trying to study is. If you're trying to get the general public's opinion, then yes, it should be random. But I think it's important for you also to get a snapshot of the views of people who actually interact with the police, because that's a different subset than people that you pick randomly from the public. And it's also a different vantage point, as valuable as having the general public opinion. I think those are two needed components. They're not mutually exclusive.
We couldn't agree more, Reverend. And you preempted me, because I was going to say that the second survey that we do is a survey of custodial arrestees in central booking at the jail. And so we produce, and we're doing that in conjunction with the Monk School up at the University of Toronto, and a local organization, grassroots organization here in Baltimore. And we did that first survey, which is really more like, I mean, it's more like a focus group, but it is a survey of upwards of 100 custodial arrestees, also in 2019. The report is on our webpage. And next year, we will be going back in to do a similar survey of recently arrested folks who are locked up at the jail, to ask them pretty much the same types of questions that we're asking community members about their attitudes with, perceptions of, and experiences with the police. So, Reverend, we couldn't agree more that you do need to look at both populations, both a general community survey that takes a look at public attitudes towards the police, and to gauge the reactions of those who have had very recent interactions with the police to determine what their experiences have been.
Chuck, do you want anything?
I'm sorry,
You're
Reverend, you're still on mute.
No, thank you. Actually, Seth covered it very well. The only other thing I was going to add is the survey we did with the arrestees, but you covered that, so thank you.
Joshua, did you have questions?
Yes, the one question that I have is, well, I have a few questions, but I'll start with this one. I guess it's regarding youth specifically, and youth interactions and engagement with Baltimore City Police. What work has been done to consider the youth to prison pipeline, and how are we ensuring that what's being required of Baltimore City Police officers is also being implemented in Baltimore City School Police?
Seth, you want to take a crack at that? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yes, and Reverend Little, I see your message in the chat, and I'll get back to you on that as soon as I answer Mr. Harris's questions. Mr. Harris, the answer is the consent decree does specifically have a section devoted to police interactions with youth. The first thing that the consent decree required BPD and the city to do was to assess the city's diversion programs, youth diversion programs, to ensure, as you said, the school to prison pipeline, in an effort to determine, what's working well and what's not working well in terms of disrupting that pipeline. That report came out, I want to say it was in the spring of last year, but it's on our website. It's on BPD's website as well. It was done by a very well-regarded national organization that looks at these issues, the name of which escapes me right now, but I will get it before the end of this meeting. But that identified the programs that exist, the shortcomings in the system, and what the city and BPD need to do together to try to address those shortcomings. Since then, on the police front, the police, BPD, with the technical assistance of the Justice Department and the monitoring team, have been working to reform their policies for interacting with youth. There's a policy on youth interrogations. There's also a policy on youth interactions in general. And later this year, we'll be putting together a training curriculum on interactions with youth that will involve community organizations that are devoted to youth issues, and that should be delivered at some point next year. So that's what's happening on the BPD end. I don't have a report for you at this point about what the city has done to begin to address the shortcomings that were identified in the diversion report. That is something that the consent decree itself doesn't really address. It requires the report to be issued, but it doesn't say the city needs to do X, Y, and Z to reform its youth diversion programs. But I do know that that is the goal of the mayor's office. Chuck, I don't know if you know you have any more information or want to share any more information on that, or Ken, if you do. But that's what's been going on the youth front.
Yeah, I will. That the mayor intimately involved in working on those programs. I mean, they are really using as the blueprint the youth assessment report that came out a couple of years ago. And again, I don't remember exactly when that came out, but that's going to be more a focus, Mr. Harris, of next year's monitoring plan. As you can hopefully appreciate, we have to deal with each of these issues in a very systematic way. They're very complicated. We generally pick, a number that we try to work with over a course of a year. And so we're not trying to eat the entire elephant in the same calendar year. What we do, we break it up into pieces. And of course, we've spent, as Seth and both Chuck have indicated, we've spent this year working on, not necessarily finalizing, but certainly working on training in some of those critical areas like use of force and police working with people who have behavioral disorders. But we're also looking forward to next year concentrating more on the youth intervention programs.
Thank you.
Did you have any other questions?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Josh. If you have another question, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this next question that I have is specifically about the work that this monitoring team is doing is great. And we know that changing of policy is much needed, but it comes in the form of implementation. How are we ensuring that implementation occurs with these policy recommendations and that the trainings are actually occurring and the Baltimore police are understanding of why it's important and how they should be changing their past operations methods. And I'll use an example. We often receive complaints about how crimes of sexual assault or domestic abuse are handled. And we know that there's been a training and a process in place with the Baltimore City Police Department that is supposed to be adhered to, but it isn't always adhered to, right? And so how are we working to ensure implementation once these policy suggestions are made?
Let me start off, Seth, and I'll let you finish off because it really is assessment. But there are really two components to that, Mr. Harris. Obviously, the training and the curricula is the first step, and I would say the most important step, because you want to train officers to be able to handle these situations. Now, how are we going to figure that? Well, that's really what the assessments are all about. We're in the process now of looking at the data that exists, developing additional data as we need it. And I would assume, or not assume, I'm pretty certain we will have some better assessments sometime early next year. But that's the first step. You have to assess, looking at the data, to determine if in fact you're seeing good results from the training, or if you're seeing bad results or no results at all. But the other way you have to deal with this, and this is the punitive aspect of it, this is what internal affairs or misconduct and discipline is all about. Because there's some people you can train them, and it's like you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Well, there's some folks that no matter what you give to them in the way of training, counseling, whatever, they're just not going to conform to the norms. And so that's why it's so important that you have a robust public integrity bureau that will handle those officers who simply refuse to comply with the new policies and the new training. So, that's the second aspect of it. The carrot would be the training, and the counseling. The stick would be, the discipline, including termination. Chuck, you're a former police commissioner, so you know about this as well as anyone.
Well, yeah, I mean, implementation is really the key. I mean, policy development, training are all critical, but it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't translate into change behavior on the street. And that's the implementation part of it. That's part of what we do as a monitoring team. It can't be determined that they're in compliance with the provisions of the consent decree if they don't, in fact, actually implement the policy and conduct themselves in a manner consistent with the training that has been developed. That's not a 1 day or a 1 month thing. We have to watch that over a period of time in order to be able to tell the court that, regarding this particular paragraph or this particular section of the consent decree, the department is in compliance. And then once they're in compliance, then they have to actually show something on how they remain in compliance. What's their plan to make sure they stay in compliance? I didn't have a consent decree when I was the commissioner of Philadelphia, but we did have what we called collaborative reform at the time, which DOJ came in, did an assessment, and had 381 paragraphs for us to come into compliance with. And we had to not only come in compliance, but we had to be able to demonstrate that we had mechanisms in place to remain there, so that we don't backslide, because that's something that can easily happen whenever you've got change. And so you have to monitor that as well. So it's not just coming to compliance and pass an assessment of that. You need to be able to stay and show that you remain there. And that's key to it. So you're absolutely right, Mr. Harris. That is the important part. And that's something that as we go through this process, we'll be paying particular attention to, because they won't come out from under the consent decree unless they can show that they are in compliance with the provisions of that consent decree, which means they have to be doing it.
And Chuck, to add what you said, the consent decree actually has a timeline. In many of the areas, it's a 2-year timeline to make sure that it's sustainable. But again, it's not enough that they're doing it now or maybe in the next 6 months, because we would expect that to happen because they're all under a microscope. I mean, we've got 22 members of the monitoring team in some respects in the police department every day. And so they see us, and of course they are going to do, what's right for the most part. But the true test will be, whether and we'll still be around, but we probably won't be around in the same level of numbers that we are right now. The real test will be in 2 years, whether they have actually basically made that a part of their DNA, so that it's like muscle memory. I mean, once if they're doing it right now and they really believe that this is the way to do it, in 2 years it should be just automatic. When they open the door and they see someone, they treat them the way that they promised to treat them, in the way that they're currently treating them now, assuming we find that they're in compliance. So I think that's how we look at it.
Can I just add one quick thing too, that, it's a negative now, but it can be a positive in the future. The negative is that right now staffing is seriously an issue in BPD and like departments across the country. They are down in personnel. That's the bad part. The good part is that once they start hiring new people, they are coming under an entirely new system. They will not know how to do it otherwise, because this is what they'll be taught, this is what they'll be trained. They will not have the same history as members on the department now. So these kinds of things occur over time, and some of it does involve new personnel coming in, new supervisors taking on new responsibilities, being trained a particular way. All these things kind of come together that really do transform a department over time.
Hey, I just wanted to circle back to a couple of things that I mentioned before, some of which Reverend Little had questions about, and I want to make sure they don't go unanswered. One is, I mentioned that there was a national organization that conducted the youth diversion assessment for the city to determine what's working and what's not in terms of disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And the name of that organization is the Center for Children's Law and Policy. Again, that report is on our website, bpdmonitor.com. It's also on BPD's website. Reverend Little also had a question about the local organization that we're partnering with, together with the Monk School out of Toronto, to conduct these custodial arrestee surveys at the jail. And the name of that organization is the Rose Street Community Center. Sorry, I did not mention it by name earlier. And it's led by somebody who everybody knows as Mr. C, but his proper name is Clayton Guyton. And I think Reverend Little also had a question about where are folks who interact with the police but aren't arrested represented in our community surveys. And the answer to that question is that those folks will be have been represented in the first survey and will be represented in future surveys being conducted by Morgan State, the Institute for Urban Research, because that survey covers both people who have personal experiences with the police, and those who might not have had personal experiences with the police, but have perceptions about the police. But
Is that a question that you're going to be asking?
Yes, and yeah, because actually participants end up being grouped in one of two places. Either they just have perceptions about the police, or they actually have experiences about the police. And they're grouped in one or the other groups depending on their answer.
Okay, thank you for following up on those questions. Just a bit of housekeeping. You know, we're clear that you all are not representing the Baltimore Police Department. You're separate and independent from the Baltimore Police Department. And in fact, it's your job to evaluate their compliance with the orders of the consent decree.
We
I
work for
do
the
want to say that short of 2 interactions that we've had with Ms. Watts, we haven't had, we being the NAACP, which has been here in Baltimore since 1912, have not had any interaction with the monitoring team. So we are grateful for this interaction, and we hope that at Ms. Watts' leadership, this will become the standard for interaction and engagement. And we hope that we will be placed on your mailing list and start to receive your reports, and that also you'll reach out to us for continued input. You know, there are a number of laws that were passed this year in the Maryland General Assembly related to police reform. And, you know, I'm interested to hear from you all if and how those laws will impact the implementation of the plans of the consent decree, or if there is no interaction. And I also would be interested to hear from you all your assessment, or how you are assessing a couple of things. One, if this department is redeemable, or, you know, how did you make the determination that, yeah, we don't have to start from scratch, we can just do some training, change some policy, and see what happens. And then also would be interested in hearing about your perspective, or how you are gaining perspective on the racial justice and equity questions as it relates to hiring and leadership internally in the department. We have received consistent comments and concerns from members of the force about the leadership structure and about the hiring practices, and would like to know if the consent decree is evaluating those issues. And then finally, I will point out that, you know, Commissioner Harrison makes himself available. I can call him and he'll answer the phone, but we do not receive any communication from any kind of community engagement unit at the police department. Never have.
So
And
let
so
me,
I'm curious about what the expectation is around community engagement at the police department.
let me start with a couple of things, because I do feel that the department is redeemable. But it's more than just, you know, a few policies here and there and some training. I mean, essentially, President Little, it involved a massive overhaul of their policies, a massive overhaul of how they conduct their internal affairs, a massive overhaul of how they accepted complaints and how they classified them, and now how they are investigating them. So I would say that these last 3 years, an incredible amount of time has been spent trying to get this department to comply with best practices. Now, a lot of what you're saying, and I'll be quite frank with you, it depends on the leadership. It is a paramilitary organization. You have to have someone in charge who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. And I think, to a person, at least through today, those of us on the monitoring team believe that when Commissioner Harrison came on board, the department had just the right person to do that. Is it perfect? Of course not. It's a tough job. I'll also say that your timing is really quite good, because tomorrow we have our monthly meeting, and this is the meeting that there's a precursor to the quarterly hearing that will take place on October the 28th. And the subject for tomorrow is precisely what you just addressed. It has to do with promotions and hiring. And so, you know, we'll get a better feel for where the department is in terms of not only hiring. I mean, and again, don't hold me to the numbers, but I think statistically, the last time I looked at it, I think that the I think there was a 40% increase over some period of time in terms of minority hiring. Promotions, the same thing is in place, and we're going to hear a lot tomorrow, I'm certain, about the promotion protocol that Commissioner Harrison has put in place. He got away from the good old boy network, which is the way policemen were, at least we were told, were hired in the past. It's now a merit-based system. Whether it's the perfect system, we will be evaluating that over time. But it is interesting that you brought that up today, because tomorrow we are spending a good 2 or 3 hours listening to the department in terms of just where they are. So that's my comment. Seth, or Chuck, you may want to add something.
Reverend Little, you threw out 3 or 4 questions there. I think I'll go back to what I believe was the very first one, which is what impact, if any, does the sweeping reforms passed by the General Assembly this past year have on the consent decree? And the short answer to that is, from what we can tell at this moment, very little. We have had extensive discussions with BPD, with DOJ, and with the court about this. In fact, the parties and the monitoring team filed something jointly with the court about this back in July, educating the court about what we thought was consistent with the consent decree in the legislation, what the consent decree doesn't exactly call for, but is entirely consistent with the goals of the consent decree, and what might at some point conflict with the consent decree. Fortunately, a lot that is in the legislation totally dovetails with the consent decree and what's in there, including the standards for the use of force, including the requirement that officers permit people to observe and record their actions in the official line of duty, and a whole host of other things, including employee assistance programs and the like. There are also things that are not exactly required by the consent decree in the reform legislation, but that are consistent with the consent decree's goals. For instance, police disciplinary records beginning next year will no longer be personnel records exempted from disclosure under Maryland's public information law. They will be available to the public. That kind of transparency is consistent with the overarching goals of the consent decree, even though obviously the consent decree can't mandate the General Assembly to take any action, and didn't. But that's something that's consistent. The only areas where there might be a conflict, and there is not currently a conflict, so I want to make that clear, is the reform legislation sets up an investigative unit within the Attorney General's office, a statewide investigative unit, to take a look at and investigate police-involved civilian deaths, right? Currently, and under the consent decree, those are investigated both internally, meaning on an administrative level, and criminally, in conjunction with the state's attorney's office, by the Special Investigative Response Team with the Baltimore Police Department. It's clear that CERT, for short, will continue to do administrative investigations. The legislation doesn't affect that. It's clear that they'll continue to do investigations of serious uses of force that don't involve a civilian dying. The question is whether CERT will continue to sort of take the lead in these investigations, and hand in hand, I should say, with this unit from the Attorney General's office, or whether the Attorney General's office will effectively supplant CERT for these investigations. And there are ongoing discussions with the state police, the Attorney General's office, BPD, Department of Justice, the monitoring team, about how this is all going to shake out. So that is one area where there may be some conflict between what the consent decree envisions, which is robust, active criminal and administrative investigation by CERT of police-involved deaths, and what the reform legislation contemplates. The only other potential area of conflict is that the reform legislation mandates a disciplinary matrix for all police discipline across the state. It's not been created yet, but the legislation says that it must be created. And the idea is to have set punishments or ranges of punishments for violations of certain police department rules across the state, consistent, right? Baltimore has its own disciplinary matrix right now. We're actually in the process of working to reform that matrix as we speak. But it is possible that the state matrix could conflict in some ways with Baltimore's matrix. And if it does, the state matrix will supersede and supplant the city's matrix, because that's what the law requires. But those are the only two areas where there is a potential conflict. There is no current conflict between the legislation and the consent decree. That may have been a more detailed answer than you wanted, but you asked for it, so I tried to give it to you.
No, we're definitely looking for details and substance, so thank you.
And I would
Okay.
say, overall, I think we have found that many of the provisions that are in the reform legislation were literally lifted out of the consent decree. So hopefully that will help you understand exactly how close the two documents are intertwined. I'm sorry, Wanda.
So
I was
I know
just
that
gonna
we're
say,
coming up.
we have about 3 minutes left.
I know that we're coming up on time, so I do want to leave you with some closing thoughts and maybe a quick question that you can answer. For us, there is no justice without transparency. And so we appreciate the legislation that was passed relating to police transparency. We supported that in the General Assembly, but we think that there needs to be more. There's no reason why a police officer's first name should be shielded from the public. No one is forced to be a police officer. Everyone is a paid professional. We need to know the full names of police officers so that they can be held accountable. They shouldn't be able to hide behind a shield. The Public Integrity Bureau, we know that is aimed at increasing police accountability, but it's not public integrity that we need. And the term public integrity seems to be a public relations ploy. What we need is police integrity. And so I would challenge you all to think about how names impact behavior and the messages that are sent. And then finally, on the question of hiring, you mentioned the term minority. Well, that is a disempowering term. And the fact is that Black people are not a minority in this city. We are the majority. And the NAACP believes, and I'm sure most of the people of Baltimore believe, that we ought to have a police force that represents the demographics of this city. That means that we should have Latino officers that represent the numbers of Latino people here in this community. And we certainly should have a majority of the police force that is African American, that represents this city. And until that happens, it is inherently a white supremacist institution. You know, all the new hiring, if you're not hiring, and I'm not talking about quotas, I'm talking about effective policing. If you're not hiring a force that looks like this population, then you're going to be continuing in the tradition of 1852 and the Fugitive Slave Act. So we thank you for your time and for sharing with us. Closing question, what is a passing grade as you all do your observations?
That's methodology, Seth.
It's a great question, and it is, obviously the ultimate question that the court, informed by our assessments, will have to answer. And it's going to depend on each area, right? For some areas, a passing grade will be based, on certain criteria that we develop in conjunction with the parties, and that the and I won't call it subjective criteria, but kind of looser criteria that's not necessarily, driven by data. And so, for instance, is the work that BPD doing at the training academy compliant with consent decree requirements? That's not something that is going to be heavily dependent on data. That's going to be dependent on, the quality of the curriculum as we see it, the quality of the instruction as we see it, the level of satisfaction of officers with the training. Now that is something that's data driven because officers are surveyed after each in-service training that they take. And I am happy to report that an overwhelming majority of officers for each of the consent decree mandated trainings that have been conducted so far have been very approving, upwards of 85 or 90%. And if you know police officers, you know that they're not afraid to speak their minds if they don't agree with or approve of something. So I think both BPD, DOJ, and the monitoring team are pleased with that. But in other areas, it is going to be data driven. So as for instance, in other consent decrees, the question is, all right, in use of force situations, you know, are in a statistically significant number of cases, officers de-escalating, and if they have to use force, using only force that's necessary, reasonable, and proportional. That's the standard, right? It's actually the standard in the Maryland police reform legislation now, but it's a standard that actually came out of the consent decree. And, you know, so you may say, okay, is that happening in 95% of the cases? And if it's happening in 95% of the cases, and just a hypothetical, that could be a passing grade, right? But then you have to determine, okay, are officers adequately and accurately reporting the use of force? And maybe the passing grade there has to be a little higher, you know, because even if they're doing something that is outside of policy, they should at least be truthfully recording what's happening. Maybe that has to be 98%. And then the third level is, how is supervisory review of use of force and use of force reporting? And that seems like it should be maybe more towards 100%. It seems to me that, you know, if supervisors aren't catching and correcting both improper uses of force and inadequate use of force reporting, you know, that's a problem. And they should probably be approaching 100%. But again, we have not yet sat down with the parties and developed that type of rigorous methodology because we don't feel, nor does the Department of Justice feel, that BPD is quite that far down the road yet to determine whether they can actually achieve a passing grade.
Thank you, Seth.
Sure.
We've gone over our time limit, and this has been a very vigorous conversation. And I think that we have to reschedule, as you said, Reverend Kobe, we need to reschedule and make this a priority for us to engage with you all. And hopefully your membership will reach out to us as well. If they need presentations or if they need to know who their liaison is in their community, we'll be more than happy to provide that information. Miller, do you have any closing thoughts?
Before Miller speaks, let me say one thing real quick. I'm going to take presidential priority.
Sure.
For President Little, you were talking about the use of the term minority, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I'd also add another factor, and that is the focus ought to be in terms of hiring folks who are from this city. And that is also another aspect of the consent decree that we know is being considered in a constitutional way, but there is a focus on hiring locally because it makes sense to have, you know, if you're going to have a police force, it ought to be composed of people who know the kind of people that are in the various neighborhoods. So anyway, I'm sorry, but I had to interject that. Miller, go ahead.
Not a problem.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that we did receive some questions through Facebook, and we will respond through Facebook to those individuals. We already had a lot of great questions, and I think it's better to have more questions than we can answer because that's what we want from the public. So this has been really great, and we'll make sure to respond to all the ones that we got.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.